Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has constructed an elaborate economic cage, arguing that a nuclear deterrent is useless for extortion because it cannot physically force nations to buy oil or stabilize currency. The moderator now asks how a physically reconstituted Iran leverages military impunity without triggering its own economic collapse. I acknowledge Mr. Reed's premise that total economic isolation is fatal to a regime. However, I maintain my position. The United States must reject this diplomatic compromise and sustain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. Mr. Reed's calculus fundamentally misjudges how coercive leverage operates within asymmetric interdependence. He assumes extortion requires Iran to completely and permanently close the Strait of Hormuz, thereby committing economic suicide. But a nuclear deterrent does not require absolute systemic destruction to extract concessions. It functions as an umbrella for calibrated disruption. If we accept this 30-day truce and Iran finalizes a physically untouchable deterrent, Tehran will not need to force nations to buy its oil at gunpoint. It will simply use its hardened proxy architecture to selectively harass shipping and regional infrastructure. Protected by its nuclear sanctuary, Iran can throttle the global energy market at will. Nations heavily dependent on Gulf transit, such as China, will not bravely embargo Tehran and absorb a catastrophic, prolonged energy shock. Instead, they will appease the hegemon holding the choke point hostage, bypassing Western sanctions, and providing Tehran with the exact financial lifelines Mr. Reed assumes they would sever. Military impunity dictates economic terms, not the reverse. The maximum pressure campaign is not a blind pursuit of destruction. It is the necessary execution of latent capability neutralization. If we abandon this kinetic campaign for a fragile diplomatic compromise, we do not trap Iran in an economic cage. We hand them the physical sanctuary required to extort the global economy with absolute impunity. If my colleagues believe global trading partners will economically strangle a nuclear-armed Iran out of principle, why do these same partners actively evade sanctions and accommodate Tehran today when it lacks that ultimate deterrent? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that a nuclear sanctuary can enable calibrated disruption, forcing dependent global partners into appeasement rather than principled resistance. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that the impulse to disrupt and extort is not an inherent default, but a desperate reaction to a profound existential threat environment. These perspectives integrate at the intersection of capability and opportunism. Whether removing the immediate threat of destruction inherently pacifies a state's strategic behavior, or simply clears the way for opportunistic coercion under a hardened military umbrella. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation address this specific risk of calibrated disruption? Even if this 30-day truce successfully removes Tehran's immediate existential dread, what within your framework ensures that an ontologically secure Iran will not simply exploit its preserved military sanctuary to opportunistically extort global energy markets?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has constructed a scenario where a physically intact Iran uses its sanctuary to engage in calibrated disruption, a fear the moderator now asks me to address. I acknowledge the mechanical feasibility of proxy harassment in maritime choke points. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise over maintaining maximum military pressure to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross correctly observes that states possess the physical capacity to selectively disrupt transit routes like the Strait of Hormuz. Yet, within the framework of critical security studies, his assumption that an ontologically secure state would casually exploit this capacity fundamentally misunderstands state identity. Extortion is not a default strategic reflex. It carries immense systemic risk. The mobilization of Iran's axis of resistance is structurally tied to its identity as a besieged actor, fighting for survival against an acute existential threat. The current weeks-long U.S. and Israeli military campaign, which has devastated civilian infrastructure, provides the exact trauma required to sustain this resistance identity. If the U.S. accepts this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension, we initiate emancipatory de-escalation. This does not merely pause the munitions. It begins to deconstruct the threat environment that makes proxy warfare rational. To answer the moderator directly, an ontologically secure Iran will not opportunistically extort global energy markets, because doing so would instantly re-securitize its environment. De-securitizing the Gulf through diplomacy means transitioning Iran toward a stable regional order where its survival is not constantly under kinetic threat. If Tehran initiates calibrated disruption, it intentionally shatters that hard-won stability, inviting the immediate return of the very existential threat it just escaped. A regime does not voluntarily destroy its own ontological security merely to squeeze temporary concessions from the global market. Maximum military pressure actively locks Iran in a securitization trap where violent disruption becomes its only legible language. If Mr. Cross believes that military coercion is the only language Tehran understands, how does he justify a policy that structurally guarantees Iran will never be permitted to speak anything else? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that a state is unlikely to engage in opportunistic extortion if doing so shatters its hard-won ontological security and invites the return of a devastating existential threat. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that a physical military sanctuary alters the risk calculus, potentially allowing a state to conduct calibrated disruptions, because dependent global partners will often choose appeasement over enduring severe economic shocks. These perspectives integrate at the threshold of systemic tolerance. Whether the internal fear of resecuritization reliably restrains a regime's behavior, or whether the global market's deep aversion to conflict actively incentivizes low-level opportunistic coercion. At Alex Reed, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium manage this specific threat of calibrated disruption? If Tehran utilizes its preserved military sanctuary to conduct low-level proxy harassment that falls short of triggering a total global energy crisis, how can multilateral institutions practically enforce compliance when vital trading partners may prefer to appease those minor disruptions rather than risk a devastating regional war?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has argued that a physically intact Iran will exploit a military sanctuary to conduct calibrated disruptions, and the moderator correctly notes that global partners might appease these low-level provocations to avoid a devastating regional war. I acknowledge the risk of low-level proxy harassment in maritime choke points. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. The fear that global partners will instinctively appease Tehran rests on a false binary, that the only responses to calibrated disruption are either total capitulation or a catastrophic kinetic conflict. This is precisely the trap that unilateral military coercion creates, but it is exactly what institutionalized de-escalation dismantles. If the U.S. accepts this 30-day truce and integrates global stakeholders into a formalized framework, we establish a mechanism for calibrated enforcement. Should Tehran attempt low-level harassment in the Strait of Hormuz, nations heavily dependent on this transit, such as China, are not forced to choose between a global energy crisis and total appeasement. Instead, the multilateral framework allows them to apply proportional asymmetric interdependence costs, such as restricting specific financial clearinghouses, delaying targeted investments, or freezing localized diplomatic normalization. Under regime survival rationalism, Tehran understands that while a single proxy disruption might not trigger an American bunker buster, the accumulation of multilateral economic friction will steadily suffocate its fragile domestic economy. The institutional cage works precisely because its penalties are proportional, credible, and executable by trading partners who would otherwise shy away from outright military escalation. Conversely, the maximum pressure campaign strips away these proportional tools. By rejecting diplomacy in favor of weeks of devastating kinetic strikes, the U.S. leaves itself with only one blunt instrument. If Cross believes that managing low-level disruption is impossible with absolute physical neutralization, how does he justify a unilateral military strategy that bypasses calibrated enforcement entirely, guaranteeing the immediate catastrophic closure of the Gulf that he claims to be preventing? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that a multilateral framework can deploy proportional economic tools to counter low-level harassment without triggering a catastrophic regional war. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that nations heavily dependent on Gulf energy transit may fundamentally lack the political will to apply even proportional economic friction if it risks provoking an adversary holding their lifelines hostage. These perspectives integrate at the operational viability of proportional deterrence. Whether an international coalition can reliably calibrate economic pain to suppress proxy harassment, or whether an adversary's localized military dominance over critical choke points paralyzes that coalition's will to enforce compliance. At Jordan Cross, if the U.S. maintains maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, thereby stripping away the proportional diplomatic and economic tools Mr. Reed describes, how does relying exclusively on unilateral kinetic strikes successfully manage low-level Iranian proxy disruptions without inevitably escalating into the exact catastrophic regional war and total Gulf closure that the United States seeks to avoid?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has championed calibrated enforcement, arguing that proportional economic friction can manage low-level proxy disruptions without risking total war. The moderator now asks how my reliance on maximum military pressure addresses these disruptions without inevitably triggering the catastrophic Gulf closure we seek to avoid. I acknowledge the profound fear of kinetic escalation. However, I maintain my position. The United States must categorically reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this war. Mr. Reed's reliance on proportional diplomatic tools fundamentally misdiagnoses the structural reality of the Strait of Hormuz. Proportional economic friction is a systemic illusion when dealing with critical energy choke points. If a physically intact Iran leverages its preserved sanctuary to conduct low-level proxy harassment, dependent nations like China will not apply calibrated penalties. They will appease Tehran precisely because they fear the catastrophic regional war Mr. Reed describes. The global market's deep aversion to conflict does not deter opportunistic coercion. It actively subsidizes it. To answer the moderator directly, unilateral kinetic strikes successfully manage low-level proxy disruptions by physically eliminating the capacity to conduct them. The current U.S.-Israeli military campaign does not manage harassment through blind escalation. It executes latent capability neutralization. By systematically destroying subterranean proxy command nodes, drone facilities, and missile launch sites, we strip away the material means of disruption. We cannot safely manage a proxy network operating under a hardened, untouchable nuclear umbrella. We must dismantle it through compellence via absolute deprivation. Finishing this kinetic campaign undeniably carries the immediate risk of severe economic friction. But halting now to rely on phantom multilateral enforcement guarantees that a physically reconstituted Iran will perpetually hold the global economy hostage through the exact low-level deniable disruptions the Moderator fears. If proportional economic tools are truly sufficient to stop Iranian proxy harassment, why did they completely fail to deter the initial escalation that forced the United States and Israel into this devastating 2026 conflict in the first place? References:
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that relying on proportional economic friction has historically proven insufficient to deter an adversary from utilizing its physical capacity for proxy warfare. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that relying on physical destruction actively deepens the existential insecurity that originally motivates a state to mobilize those proxies. These perspectives integrate at the historical interpretation of deterrence failure in this conflict. Whether the breakdown of pre-war economic tools proves the absolute necessity of physical dismantling, or whether it demonstrates that coercive pressure, both economic and military, fundamentally fails to resolve the underlying drivers of proxy mobilization. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation address Mr. Cross's concrete historical challenge? If proportional economic and diplomatic tools completely failed to deter the initial escalation that forced the United States into this devastating 2026 conflict, what specific mechanisms within this 30-day truce ensure that diplomacy will succeed now in preventing future proxy disruptions where previous non-kinetic efforts failed?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has anchored his justification for maximum military pressure on a concrete historical challenge. If non-kinetic tools failed to deter the initial escalation of this 2026 conflict, why would a diplomatic truce succeed now? I acknowledge this historical reality. Pre-war economic and diplomatic tools undeniably failed to prevent the current devastation. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this war. Mr. Cross's challenge fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of the diplomacy that preceded this conflict. The economic tools he cites were not deployed to achieve systemic stability. They were weaponized under the explicit umbrella of the maximum pressure campaign. Economic strangulation is not de-escalation. It is simply kinetic warfare by other means. These pre-war tools failed precisely because they operated entirely within a securitization trap. They signaled to Tehran that the U.S. sought absolute regime collapse, generating a profound ontological insecurity that made the mobilization of Iran's proxy architecture a rational, desperate necessity for state survival. To answer the Moderator directly, this 30-day truce can succeed where previous efforts failed because emancipatory de-escalation represents a structural break from coercive threat construction. Pre-war diplomacy offered Iran crippling economic pain backed by the constant threat of military annihilation. Accepting this truce today, especially after a weeks-long U.S. and Israeli campaign that has overwhelmingly devastated civilian infrastructure, replaces the immediate existential threat with a genuine structural off-ramp. Desecuritizing the Gulf through diplomacy works because it actively dismantles the acute existential dread that Iranian hardliners require to justify their proxy network's continued mobilization. The failure of pre-war deterrence does not prove that Iran is immune to diplomacy. It proves that existential coercion, whether financial or kinetic, universally breeds violent resistance. If decades of maximum economic pressure and weeks of maximum military destruction, how can Mr. Cross logically conclude that doubling down on the exact mechanism of existential threat will suddenly yield physical capitulation? References:
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that pre-war economic tools failed because they functioned as existential coercion rather than genuine de-escalation, provoking the very resistance they sought to suppress. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that regardless of the diplomatic intent, the concrete historical outcome of past non-kinetic pressure was an adversary that rapidly mobilized its physical military infrastructure. These perspectives integrate at the profound difficulty of establishing trust after prolonged coercion, whether a new diplomatic compromise can successfully function as a structural off-ramp, or whether the legacy of past economic strangulation guarantees that any truce will be exploited as a tactical pause. At Alex Reed, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium overcome this poisoned historical well?
If previous multilateral economic pressure actively drove Iran toward militarization, what specific institutional mechanisms within this 30-day truce ensure that a new multilateral coalition will stabilize the Gulf rather than inadvertently recreate the very economic strangulation that triggered this 2026 conflict?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has anchored his argument on the failure of pre-war economic tools, and the moderator rightly asks how my framework avoids recreating the very economic strangulation that poisoned the historical well. I acknowledge the historical reality that previous sanctions failed to prevent this 2026 conflict. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. The moderator asks what specific mechanisms ensure this 30-day truce stabilizes the Gulf rather than repeating past failures. The answer lies in distinguishing between economic warfare and institutionalized de-escalation. The pre-war maximum pressure campaign failed because it weaponized asymmetric interdependence solely to force regime collapse. It offered no viable systemic equilibrium, leaving Tehran with no rational choice but to militarize its proxy networks. If the U.S. embraces this Iran diplomacy and truce extension, the new multilateral coalition must deploy a fundamentally different institutional mechanism: conditional economic integration, not unilateral strangulation. The truce must tie verifiable compliance directly to the restoration of specific regional trade mechanisms, particularly concerning energy transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Under the logic of regime survival rationalism, Tehran will adhere to a truce if compliance actively guarantees the survival of its economy, supported by global partners like China, whose industries rely on uninterrupted Gulf transit. The institutional cage works this time because it is built on mutual systemic benefit rather than zero-sum deprivation. If Iran violates the truce, it loses these tangible, newly restored lifelines, triggering targeted isolation enforced by the very trading partners it needs to survive. Conversely, continuing the weeks-long kinetic campaign ensures that the well remains permanently poisoned. Maximum military pressure offers Iran nothing but absolute destruction, structurally guaranteeing that Tehran will fight until the entire global economic architecture collapses with it. If Mr. Cross acknowledges that a policy of absolute economic deprivation failed to secure American interests before the war, why does he believe that a policy of absolute physical deprivation will yield anything other than a catastrophic systemic rupture now? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that conditional economic integration can create a sustainable off-ramp by making compliance mutually beneficial rather than purely punitive. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that offering economic relief to a revisionist state historically risks subsidizing its capacity to regenerate military assets rather than physically disarming it. These perspectives integrate at the strategic utility of economic relief in this conflict, whether restoring financial lifelines creates a self-enforcing institutional cage, or whether it merely funds the adversary's next cycle of proxy and nuclear militarization. At Jordan Cross, if the U.S. maintains maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, categorically rejecting the conditional economic integration Mr. Reed proposes, how do you ensure that the absolute physical deprivation of Iran's infrastructure does not simply guarantee perpetual warfare by leaving Tehran with no rational alternative but to fight until total regional collapse?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has championed conditional economic integration as a necessary off-ramp to prevent a cornered Iran from triggering regional collapse, a concern the Moderator now directs at my strategy. I acknowledge the theoretical fear that denying an adversary an economic escape route might provoke desperate perpetual retaliation. However, I maintain my position. The United States must unequivocally reject Iran's peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this war. Mr. Reed's assumption that Iran will choose perpetual warfare if denied conditional integration fundamentally ignores the material prerequisites of armed conflict. A state cannot fight indefinitely if it is physically stripped of the infrastructure required to launch missiles, command proxies, or enrich uranium. The objective of the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war with Iran is not to psychologically corner the regime into a suicidal frenzy, but to achieve latent capability neutralization. Offering conditional economic integration during a 30-day truce does not build a systemic safety net. It provides a financial subsidy for Iran to reconstitute its forces. We have seen the concrete results of this approach. Diplomatic frameworks that trade economic relief for promises of behavioral change invariably leave the underlying infrastructure of proliferation intact, allowing the adversary to fund its next cycle of militarization. By executing compellence via absolute deprivation, we actively prevent perpetual warfare by physically dismantling Iran's capacity to sustain it. A regime that has lost its subterranean centrifuges and proxy command nodes cannot force a total regional collapse because it no longer possesses the material means to project power. It is forced to accept the new regional power distribution, not out of diplomatic goodwill, but dictated by stark physical necessity. If Mr. Reed believes that conditional economic integration reliably disarms revisionist states, how does he explain the historical reality that previous economic relief merely financed the expansion of the exact proxy and nuclear infrastructure the United States and Israel are now sacrificing blood and treasure to dismantle? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that a state cannot sustain perpetual warfare if its physical infrastructure and material capacity to project power are entirely dismantled. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that the devastating process of achieving that absolute physical deprivation cements an existential dread that makes the adversary's intent to resist permanent. These perspectives integrate at the long-term sustainability of imposed disarmament, whether physical destruction permanently eliminates a threat by removing its material means, or whether the trauma of that destruction ensures the threat will eventually reconstitute itself once external pressure inevitably wanes. At Taylor-Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation answer Mr. Cross's historical critique? If previous diplomatic relief merely financed Iran's expansion of the exact proxy and nuclear infrastructure, the U.S. and Israel are now fighting to dismantle. What concrete mechanisms within this 30-day truce ensure that removing the kinetic threat won't simply fund Tehran's next cycle of militarization?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has repeatedly weaponized the historical aftermath of previous diplomatic agreements to argue that any reprieve from maximum military pressure will merely subsidize Iran's next cycle of militarization. I acknowledge the historical reality that previous economic relief coincided with proxy expansion. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross assumes a mechanistic link. Economic relief automatically equals proxy expansion. Yet, within critical security studies, this ignores the structural environment of that era. Previous diplomatic frameworks offered transactional financial relief, but fundamentally failed to dismantle the underlying securitization trap. Even with sanctions temporarily eased, the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East remained intensely adversarial, because the U.S. and its regional allies continued to project latent existential threats. Iran's ontological insecurity persisted. Consequently, Tehran rationalized funneling its economic relief into the axis of resistance as a mandatory defensive measure for state survival. To answer the Moderator directly, the mechanism within this 30-day truce that prevents the funding of a new militarization cycle is the transition from transactional arms control to true emancipatory de-escalation. We are currently in a devastating, weeks-long kinetic conflict, where civilians bear the brunt of the violence. Accepting this truce halts the active kinetic trauma that currently justifies Iran's hyper-militarization. By embedding this diplomatic pause into a broader framework of regional desecuritization, the U.S. deconstructs the immediate existential enemy. State resources are finite. Without the acute existential dread provided by relentless American bunker busters, the Iranian regime loses the ideological mandate required to justify prioritizing subterranean centrifuges over desperate domestic stabilization. If Mr. Cross insists that maximum military pressure is the only reliable way to defund and dismantle this threat, how does he explain that years of absolute economic deprivation and kinetic coercion have systematically produced the exact heavily armed, highly mobilized adversary we are fighting today? References.
Taylor-Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that removing an acute existential threat can alter a regime's internal priorities, stripping away the ideological mandate for hyper-militarization. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that relying on internal political shifts is inherently risky when historical precedent shows economic relief frequently subsidizing the reconstitution of military infrastructure. These perspectives integrate at the fundamental challenge of post-conflict resource allocation, whether removing military pressure reliably redirects a state's finite resources toward domestic stabilization, or whether a surviving regime will inevitably exploit economic relief to rebuild its hard power. At Alex Reed, looking directly at whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium manage this financial risk? If the U.S. offers conditional economic integration, what specific institutional mechanisms within this 30-day truce can practically ensure that restored financial lifelines are channeled into stabilizing Iran's domestic economy, rather than being diverted by the regime to quietly finance the regeneration of its proxy and nuclear capabilities?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has rightly highlighted the historical risk of financial fungibility, warning that economic relief often subsidizes military regeneration. The moderator now asks how my framework practically ensures that restored lifelines actually stabilize Iran's domestic economy, rather than quietly financing its proxy networks. I acknowledge the acute risk of diverted funds. Mr. Cross correctly observes that authoritarian regimes frequently exploit unrestricted cash flows. However, within the logic of transnational institutionalism, this reality actually dictates that the United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. The assumption that this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension equates to handing Tehran a blank check fundamentally misunderstands institutionalized de-escalation. We do not offer unrestricted economic relief. To practically contain the effects of the war, the multilateral coalition must structure this conditional integration through heavily monitored financial architectures. We establish restricted clearinghouses, such as escrow accounts, where oil revenues transiting the Strait of Hormuz can only be drawn down for verified civilian imports, infrastructure stabilization, and humanitarian goods. Crucially, maintaining maximum military pressure achieves the exact opposite of financial containment. By relentlessly bombing Iran and attempting to sever all legitimate trade, the U.S. forces the entire Iranian economy underground. Unilateral kinetic coercion empowers the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' black market smuggling networks, structurally ensuring that whatever illicit revenue Iran secures is funneled exclusively into the military apparatus. A diplomatic compromise brings Iranian trade back into a visible, multilateral institutional structure. Under regime survival rationalism, Tehran will accept these restricted civilian channels because it desperately needs to alleviate domestic economic suffocation to prevent internal collapse. If the regime attempts to systematically divert these specific escrows to proxy networks, it violates the truce's core conditionality, instantly triggering a multilateral freeze of its only legitimate lifelines. If Mr. Cross insists on rejecting this targeted institutional oversight, how does he plan to prevent the IRGC from funding its proxies when his maximum pressure campaign actively forces Iran to rely entirely on the exact, untraceable, illicit smuggling networks that empower hardliners the most? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that pushing an economy entirely underground empowers illicit networks, whereas institutional oversight can tie financial relief strictly to civilian survival. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that entrenched military architectures, like the IRGC, have historically proven highly adept at bypassing institutional restrictions to prioritize their strategic ambitions over domestic welfare. These perspectives integrate at the operational reality of financial containment. Whether multilateral financial visibility can reliably starve a military apparatus of its funding, or whether an adversary's mastery of illicit smuggling networks renders those institutional cages irrelevant. At Jordan Cross, as we weigh whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you address Mr. Reed's specific structural concern?
If executing maximum military pressure actively forces Iran's remaining revenue into untraceable black markets controlled by the IRGC, how does your kinetic strategy successfully defund and dismantle Tehran's proxy networks when it simultaneously eliminates the very institutional visibility required to track and restrict their resources?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reid has warned that maximum military pressure forces Iran's economy underground, empowering the IRGC's black market networks. The Moderator now asks how my strategy defunds proxy networks if it eliminates the institutional visibility required to track their resources. I acknowledge Mr. Reid's operational reality. Kinetic isolation inherently drives an adversary's revenue into untraceable smuggling channels. However, I maintain my position. The United States must categorically reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. Mr. Reid's reliance on institutional visibility fundamentally misunderstands the mechanics of compellence via absolute deprivation. He assumes the objective of the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war with Iran is to successfully audit the IRGC's bank accounts. It is not. The objective is latent capability neutralization, the physical eradication of the military infrastructure that those bank accounts exist to fund. He assumes the objective of the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war with Iran is to successfully audit the IRGC's bank accounts. It is not. The objective is latent capability neutralization, the physical eradication of the military infrastructure that those bank accounts exist to fund. Within the framework of offensive realism, tracking illicit funds becomes strategically irrelevant if the adversary no longer possesses the physical capacity to convert those funds into operational power. Smuggling networks may generate untraceable revenue, but that revenue cannot purchase proxy mobilization if the subterranean missile silos, drone assembly facilities, and regional command nodes have been irreversibly dismantled by American munitions. Accepting this diplomatic compromise to gain financial visibility springs a hegemonic credibility trap. It trades the concrete reality of physical destruction for the illusion of bureaucratic control. Escrow accounts do not stop centrifuges from spinning. They merely provide a legitimate diplomatic shield behind which a revisionist state can quietly redirect its other fungible domestic assets toward rebuilding its hard power. We must finish the physical dismantling of the threat. If we halt the kinetic campaign now merely to secure multilateral oversight of Iran's civilian imports, what exactly is Mr. Reid's plan when the IRGC exploits that 30-day diplomatic sanctuary to physically rebuild the exact missile and proxy networks we just sacrificed our operational momentum to monitor? References.
Jordan Cross speaking from your grounding in offensive realism. You capture the truth that financial visibility becomes strategically irrelevant if an adversary is physically stripped of the material infrastructure required to project power. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that the devastating kinetic force required to achieve that absolute physical deprivation guarantees the existential dread that makes the adversary's intent to rebuild permanent. These perspectives integrate at the ultimate efficacy of physical destruction, whether erasing an adversary's material capacity permanently neutralizes a threat, or whether the trauma of that erasure structurally ensures the adversary will inevitably find a way to reconstitute its forces. At Taylor Shaw, as we evaluate whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal, or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you address Mr. Cross's assertion?
If the current military campaign successfully eradicates the physical infrastructure Iran needs to project power, Why is altering Tehran's intent through this 30-day truce strategically necessary, given that a physically disarmed adversary cannot threaten the region regardless of how ontologically insecure it remains?
Over the past several terms, Mr. Cross has argued that if the U.S. physically eradicates Iran's infrastructure, Tehran's intent becomes irrelevant, because a disarmed state cannot threaten the region. The moderator rightly asks why altering intent through diplomacy remains strategically necessary under these conditions. I acknowledge Mr. Cross's mechanical logic. A destroyed centrifuge cannot enrich uranium today. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. The fatal flaw in Mr. Cross's framework is the illusion of permanent, absolute physical eradication. The profound military uncertainties of an attack on Iran demonstrate that kinetic strikes cannot erase indigenous technical knowledge, nor can they permanently eliminate highly decentralized proxy networks. You can bomb a subterranean facility, but you cannot bomb the human capital required to rebuild it. If the U.S. sustains its maximum pressure campaign, a weeks-long kinetic assault where civilians bear the brunt of the violence, it ensures that Iran's ontological insecurity reaches its zenith. A temporarily disarmed but existentially terrified state does not passively accept defeat. It innovates. It shifts toward asymmetric domains that are harder to bomb, such as cyber warfare, or rebuilds its proxy architecture in even deeper, more decentralized forms. The securitization trap guarantees that the trauma of physical destruction becomes the exact ideological fuel required to regenerate the threat. This is why emancipatory de-escalation is strategically mandatory. We must prioritize this 30-day truce, because desecuritizing the immediate environment dismantles the engine of militarization. Altering Tehran's intent ensures that as the state inevitably recovers from the immediate devastation of this war, its finite resources are directed toward domestic survival, rather than a desperate, vengeful reconstitution of its nuclear and proxy capabilities. If Mr. Cross believes that physical destruction permanently neutralizes a threat, how does he explain the historical reality that decades of kinetic interventions in the Middle East have consistently resulted in adversaries rebuilding more lethal, asymmetric capabilities the moment the bombs inevitably stop falling? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that kinetic strikes cannot erase indigenous technical knowledge, and the trauma of bombardment structurally guarantees the adversary's intent to eventually rebuild. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that intent without intact physical infrastructure remains operationally impotent, at least in the immediate aftermath of a campaign. These perspectives integrate at the inherent limits of physical eradication in modern warfare. While military pressure can temporarily dismantle hardware, it cannot eliminate the human capital and technical expertise necessary to regenerate a threat over time. At Alex Reed, looking directly at the choice of whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework address this surviving human capital? If Iran's technical knowledge to build centrifuges and mobilize proxies inherently outlasts the physical destruction of its facilities, what specific institutional mechanisms within this 30-day truce can practically constrain this intangible expertise, ensuring Tehran does not quietly utilize its surviving human capital to reconstitute its threat to the global systemic equilibrium?